musique bruitiste et matérialité sonore, avec une présentation de Michael Goddard, l'exploration des paradoxes des mondes industriels, bruit et musique. Donc, docteur Michael Goddard est senior lectureur et coordinateur de recherche doctorale à l'université de Salford.
Okay, so this paper will seek to address industrial noise music in relation to ideas of worlds, sound worlds, world music, and ideas of world forming, even the generation of other and alternate worlds. Well, some genres of EDM, like trance techno, have frequently been seen as an often exoticizing engagement with a range of world musics via practices of appropriation and sampling. Such techniques were pioneered in early industrial forms of electronic music, often using highly intuitive techniques and bricolage technologies, but with conceptual approaches often removed from the kitsch domestication of the other, evident in many other forms of electronic world music. Rather, such practices approach more what James Clifford has described as ethnographic surrealism, producing and rearticulating clashes and contradictions between the West and its others. Of course, most of the music examined here were not created as art or official musics, but outsider contributions to popular culture, what might be called unpopular culture. So the techniques and tactics for engaging with otherness were not always as reflective as they might be. Nevertheless, the prejudice that these musics are somehow intrinsically white, Anglo, racist, and even fascist continue today, even in apparently sympathetic texts like S. Alexander Reid's recent Assimilate. This paper will instead engage with concepts of music worlds in order to see industrial exotica rather differently as a kind of incompletely staged clash between Western musical inheritance, both classical and popular, and various others, as a type of heterotopia, to use Foucault's term, in which noise plays a fundamental and destabilizing role, notably absent in other genres like trance, for example. Okay, so this is a bit where it's coming out of. I've done this sort of previous research looking at various kinds of industrial music and so forth, and also looking at kind of research on noise and music scenes and so forth. So there's an extensive literature on popular music in place, both how certain forms and genres and of forms of music are informed by iconic times and places, resulting in specific sounds, London punk, Mersey sound, whatever. But also increasingly how music has played a role in the reconfiguration of cities as creative environments, as can be seen in different ways in such post-industrial cities as Detroit, Manchester, and so forth. And this is something that's been informing my sort of research at the moment. Noise, however, is resistant to such localizing, even in a dynamic way. Noise and industrial artists have typically been outsiders, both from the academy and from popular music, so there's really any relation or recognizable identity between a noise industrial scene in a particular city, at least not one that the city concerned is likely to recognize. Nevertheless, industrial and noise practices do take place in certain spaces, typically in relatively abandoned zones of post-industrial. This is some examples. Relatively abandoned zones of post-industrial decay, such as Throbbing Gristle in Hackney, Cabaret Voltaire in Sheffield, or Einstütz in the Neubauten in the abandoned non-spaces of West Berlin. Other industrial performers like Test Department produced series of site-specific works with a really acknowledged kinship to environmental ambient music and sound art, even at a far remove from any Schaefferian notions of natural soundscapes. More specifically, noise scenes often form around very few, or sometimes even single urban sites, such as a recently closed Plano Bay in Rio de Janeiro. That was not only the hub, and I think there's one image that's from Plano Bay down there, I think it's the bottom one. That was not only the hub of a Rio noise scene, but also a key point in the global circulation of noise performers, like Zbigniew Kakowski. This points to another particularity of noise scenes. While hyper-localized within a particular city, compared to the wider circuits of rock pubs and EDM clubs, they're also usually globally connected, since there's a long history of compensating for a lack of a sizable local scene through practices of international exchange that go back to mail art and tape exchange networks, and also extended to flows of performers and audiences. So you could run into Karkovsky on the steps outside Plano Bay in Rio de Janeiro, and that's a fairly normal sort of kind of thing to happen around international noise scenes. Okay, so I'm going to move on from this into the idea of sound worlds, which I think is an important concept to think about industrial music and its relation as a kind of a world music. So, in terms of the connection between industrial noise and world music, it's important to look at some of the different connotations of the word world. For example, Heidegger and other philosophers have distinguished between the world as representation, a flat representation of a world as a picture, and more existential processes of welding, the generation of environmental relations for an individual being or a collectivity. For Heidegger, being always presumes a world, hence Dasein as being in the world, but even more interesting is the modification of this idea by Deleuze as being for the world, the affirming of a certain world that is actualized from amongst all the infinite possible worlds referred to in Leibnizian philosophy. Worlding is therefore a much more dynamic concept than the world as representation, and also enables the distinction between different practices, including musical ones. The concept is not only active, but also plural, with different activities and practices generating different heterogeneous worlds, rather than a single representation of a unified world as in a world map, which will always be both flat and reductive and biased and distorted. Instead, welding or world formation corresponds more to Philip K. Dick's question of how to construct a world that doesn't fall apart 5 minutes later, which is essentially a compositional question in both an artistic and in a philosophical sense. And in his contribution to our volume Resonances, the Brazilian writer and composer J.P. Caron discussed Peter Strauss's thought experiment of imagining a purely auditory world without distinguishable spatio-temporal objects and perceiving subjects. Such a world would not only make identification and recognition of objects problematic, but would also annihilate space itself, since the latter depends on these coordinates. While this thought experiment is in a sense an impossible one, Caron used it to support the idea of, quote, the dimension of the intrinsic space of sounds, which is not reducible to the empirical space we experience when we think of the distance between physical objects, or even the distances we can infer by listening to the sounds they make. In other words, this distinguishes the audible space generated by musical noise from being a representation of the empirical world, but instead argues that it is the generation of a world, a process in which noise would be the fundamental condition of possibility for the more structured and ordered worlds of music, rather than an unwanted excess to be eliminated. As Caron cites Paul Hegarty, if music offers an inhabitable world, noise offers something more like dark matter, which may be what allows a structure for everything else to exist. And yet these poles of noise as condition of possibility for sonic world formation, and music as a result of that process, would exist on a continuum without any fundamental break between these extremes. And this is where you get sort of the idea of the sort of pan-sonorous noise spectrum, for example, out of which various different forms of structures and music can emerge. And you get a quite precise description of this sort of active world formation in the now famous account of a production of Throbbing Gristle's album Second Annual Report. This album was composed of largely synthetic sounds produced by bricolage machinery and not field recordings or site-specific performances. And yet, as Genesis P-Orridge described it, quote, when we finished that first record, we went outside and we suddenly heard trains going past and little workshops under the railway arches and the lathes going and electric saws, and we suddenly thought, we haven't actually created anything at all. We've just taken it in subconsciously and recreated it. While this might sound at first like an unexpected account of representation of the empirical world, the language used makes clear that while this was expressive of its surrounding urban environment, it was not a representation of it. In other words, they generated a sound world unconsciously informed by and expressive of their decaying urban surroundings. And one of the key sort of publications connected to industrial music culture was obviously research coming out of San Francisco when the punk zines Search and Destroy turned into something rather different. And it was notable not only for its inclusion of as industrial culture of non-musical practices ranging from reading lists to the chaotic machine performances of survival research laboratories, but also for several references to musical exotica, especially to the work of Martin Denny. A later edition of research would be devoted. You can sort of see this on the right. A later edition of research would be devoted to incredibly strange music, in which exotica took a major place, following from the interest showed in exotica by Throbbing Gristle themselves. This might seem surprising given the apparently avant-garde intentions of the group, coming in the wake of the already tabula rasa punk movement that seemed to want to eradicate pre-existing musical structures and instrumentation in favour of a radically new, electronic and experimental, punk being rejected for being merely renovated, and ultimately conventional rock and roll, itself based on blues patterns going back to agrarian slave cultures. Under the slogan of industrial music for industrial people, the idea was to at least update music to the Industrial Revolution and the machine age. However, the fascination with cultural outsiders, from occultists to serial killers, also extended to musical exotica as practiced by Denny and others. And without going into too much detail, such exotica has often been seen as an uneasy incorporation and romanticization of non-Western cultural traditions within Western music as a form of cultural tourism or Orientalism, usually coupled with a promotion of the pleasures of hi-fi recording and playback technologies. So it's a typical Martin Denny album cover. To quote Phil Ford, the exotic imagination is Orientalist, whether or not the places it envisions are literally Oriental or even belong to the real world. So you can have like space age exotica as well. This is, however, only one reading of exotica, which at the same time can also be read as destabilizing Western hierarchies and cultural superiority by generating a clash between Western culture and its outside, even if this outside is romanticized and orientalized. Seen in the light of surrealist ethnography, the heterogeneity of exotica's musical and sonic materials, as well as its own debased status within Western musical hierarchies, has a radical potential not lost on practitioners of industrial music, as the same critic also seems to suggest. Quote, when intellectuals handle this music with a hermeneutic equivalent of tongs in a hazmat suit, they are in a sense not hearing it at all. So maybe it's worth listening to, okay, well this is where I was going to play you some exotica. So if you actually listen to Martin Denny, you can find in the Throbbing Gristle album, Journey Through a Body, almost like a cover version of the Martin Denny track Exotica under the title of Exotic Functions. And it's really surprising how much they've just really literally recreated Martin Denny, which it seems quite surprising for a group that's seen usually very much in a sort of a tabula rasa, hyper avant-garde kind of a way. Okay, so there'll be quite a lot to say about this music, which is clearly Orientalist on one level, but also stages a strange cross-cultural encounter and making strange of Western cultural traditions that industrial groups picked up on. So Throbbing Gristle, as I said, produced their own exotica, already on the song of the same name on 20 Jazz Funk Greats, but also particularly in Exotic Functions, which is basically like a Martin Denny cover. And what these groups were interested in, and clearly here very far from the usual constructs of industrial noise as painful, ugly and transgressive, was the ability of exotica to generate a sonic world which, however rooted in histories of colonialism, exceeds these histories in a type of heterotopia. To remain within a representational paradigm would be to only see the Orientalist side of these practices, whereas from a point of view of worlding, such forms of music have the potential to propose a different kind of world music that takes the cross-cultural encounters of colonialism as a point of departure to create something else. And so, basically I just wanted to kind of look at, a few of these sort of exotic presences in industrial music as something to sort of think about, particularly in line of these sort of arguments of industrial music as being white or Anglo or racist or, or even fascist. Okay, so the group SBK, for example, which you're going to hear about more later today, they're very famous for their early output being, absolutely extremely harsh, mechanical, industrial noise of, an almost unlistenable variety, which you can hear on something like Information Overload Unit. But if you listen to, they do, after their rather regrettable attempt to produce industrial funk in metal dance, when they put out their I think their third album, or maybe their fourth album, Zamia Lamani, there were some amazing tracks on this, like In Flagrante Delicto, which is really like something like some cross between sort of opera, sort of Middle Eastern music, and this kind of air of a kind of a tragic, still with some sort of sonic experimentation, but very much engaging with sort of other forms of music in order to create a very, very strange, very intense kind of a world. And they were hardly alone in this kind of in this kind of activity that is putting together traditional non-Western musics with modern recording techniques producing sort of very interesting results. And these kind of passages were hardly unique to SPK. Einstürzende Neubauten, famous for using found objects and environments of West Berlin as sonic architecture to generate their own Artodian noise music, also turned to some more traditional non-Western materials, for example, in the piece Armenia from the Drawings of OT album. This piece overlays their usual sonic materials, banging on found objects, screaming vocals, etc., on recording of an Armenian folk tune, again resulting in a strange and paradoxical juxtaposition between Western industrial decay and non-Western traditional musics. Perhaps an even more interesting example can be found in the work of Cabaret Voltaire, whose initial experiments with tape cut-ups drawing on mainly Western avant-garde traditions progressively became infused with non-white musical instruments such as sampled funk bass riffs, ultimately leading to an earlier version of industrial funk dance music on albums like The Crackdown or Microphonies. Stephen Mallender was particularly keen to distance the group from any implications that their musical universe was a white one, talking about the importance of them of performers like James Brown. On their 1981 Red Mecca album, this is particularly interesting in this respect because it was responding to simultaneous upheavals in both the Middle East and the West, mirroring the rise of Christian fundamentalism in the US that informs their Voice of America album, with that of Islamic fundamentalism taking place at the same time as the hostage crisis in Iran and riots on the streets of the UK. In this light, the presence of non-Western sonic materials is far from the Orientalism arguably evident in the SPK, for example, and points to the clashes between different yet parallel modernities that turned out to be highly prescient. And you can get a sense of that if you listen to some of the tracks off Red Mecca, particularly Black Musk. Okay, so finally, and as a final example of a reverse of this process of a kind of world music becoming Europeanized, but in a way that perhaps critically foregrounds the kitsch nature of a lot of world music, particularly trance techno. And this example is the Laibach cover of a Juno Reactor track, God is God. And I was only doing the research for this talk that I actually discovered that this was a cover. I never came across the Juno Reactor, well, it was only fairly recently I came across the Juno Reactor song. And the Juno Reactor song is absolutely different to the Laibach rendition of this track. So they basically took a song whose aim was clearly the universality of the common features of world religions in a sort of a New Age sense, with reference to Middle Eastern and Christian religions all being sort of united by a nice kind of techno beat. And basically they all of these sort of traces of the other are completely wiped out in the Laibach version, as if echoing the practices of colonialism itself, leaving only a bombastic heavy metal riff and strident vocals to a positively Christian choral backing. Okay, just one final aspect of Exotica that this talk would not be complete without, is a kind of world music that's less interested in different human cultures than interactions between humans and non-humans, whether in the form of alien beings, machines, or artificial intelligence. This can especially be seen in the band Chrome, who from their first album Alien Soundtrack through to the Blood on the Moon were generating an interplanetary imaginary composed of multiple worlds, as can be heard on tracks like Eyes on Mars, for example. Similarly, Baltaspace, who only fit to some extent within the industrial music paradigm, consistently explored a neo-futurist industrial vision of robot worlds, time machines, nuclear reactors, space travel, and technical malfunctions that they themselves described as orbital. Such interplanetary, machinic, or alien perspectives are worth bearing in mind when considering the industrial exotica we've discussed today. It's only partly accurate to see such music as appropriations of non-Western musical and cultural traditions in order to make industrial music more seductive, danceable, or otherwise sexy. It's also the generation of a particular sonic and experiential world that incorporates heterogeneous materials in a kind of non-unified heterotopia or other space. This may be a less extreme auditory world than those generated by pure noise musics, but there are nevertheless highly interesting ones in which the world-forming capacities of sonic noise operate more subtly as a kind of cultural noise, generating clashes between different practices and traditions that maintains their heterogeneity in contradistinction to generic world music whose New Age celebration of oneness barely disguises assimilationist agendas of eradicating differences while celebrating them. In this respect, Paul Simon's exploitation of African singers and musical performers and incorporation of their voices within his Graceland album might be considerably more offensive than William Bennett's Cut Hands Africa Noise project, that at least maintains the agonistic confrontation between Western and non-Western musics and cultural traditions. And I do apologize you couldn't hear any of that, but there's plenty of things to follow up if you were interested. Thank you very much.